Welcome to Strip Cover Lit, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we're here for the third in a four-part series as we play with a doll's house. And what happened in this section, here we are at the beginning of this section with Mrs. Lynde sitting distractedly at the table while the party is going on upstairs. She is waiting, it turns out, for the Krog, and when he shows up, he is very surprised that she wants to talk to him. He is sour because he feels like she rebuked his advances when they were younger the minute a more successful man came along. They both expressed the lows that their lives have gone through since that moment in the intervening years, and she expresses how she had to take care of her mother and her brothers at the time, so she didn't feel like she had much of a choice. She then suggests that they marry now. Krog is happy, elated, and excited, and he accepts her offer for marriage. He says in response that he will take back his letter that he had deposited, that is in an attempt to blackmail Torvald, which is still waiting for him to pick it up. Mrs. Lynde says no. She says that Torvald and Nora's relationship needs this wrong to be cleared. They need to clear the air. Nora and Torvald, or Krog leaves, as Mrs. Lynde is hearing Nora and Torvald approach from the party. And when Torvald goes to get candles, Mrs. Lynde tells Nora that she has to come clean. Mrs. Lynde leaves, and Torvald tries to get romantic. Nora then rebukes him. Rank shows up and sticks around long enough to make covert passes at Nora, get a cigar, and then jets. Torvald then retrieves the mail and finds 2 letters from Rank, including one that looks like an announcement of his death. Nora confirms this, says that he is sick and has chosen to go off, shut himself in, and die. Torvald is momentarily distressed and then seems to come to ease with the decision because he does know that his friend has been suffering. He then retrieves with the rest of his letters momentarily before bursting from the room furious because he has read the letter from Krog. Another letter comes after they have a fight over what is going on, and it is the bond back from Krog. Torvald then forgives Nora, and forgives Nora, and forgives Nora, and forgives Nora, and Nora, in turn, becomes furious. Why? Because they've been married for 8 years, and this is the first serious conversation that they've had in their relationship. Nora has decided, it seems, that she is through being an ornament. And Torvald tries to keep her, tries to make it up to her, tries to tell her everything will change. But all she really wanted when Torvald found this letter was that Torvald should publish it, out Krog as a villain, out Nora as a villain as well, essentially, as a scoundrel, and thereafter both her and Torvald would live in disgrace, which is a strange thing, it seems, on the surface for her to have wanted. They argue, and Torvald pleads, but she insists that they trade rings. They do trade rings, and Nora takes off saying that Torvald is not to make any attempt to contact her. And we will begin the discussion of this section, this final act, this third act of the 3-part play, where we spent the bulk of the time, I think, during the last discussion, and that is with Nora as an ornament. On 55, we get this quote. As Torvald takes off his shawl, "Yes, take a good look at her," speaking of Nora. "I think she is worth looking at. Isn't she charming, Mrs. Lynde?" Referring to Nora as charming simply based on her looks. Simply based on the fact that she is ornamental. This is furthered on 66. I gotta find the right quote here. Nora being mad at Torvald, "You have never loved me. You only thought it pleasant to be in love with me." That is to say that she was ornamental, that she was to be admired and observed, not interacted with, much in the way that Torvald has interacted with her this entire time. But that question of Nora being ornamental, Nora being childlike, Nora being there to serve a purpose, but not through action. She is there to inspire. She is there to be looked out for, much in the way that children are. She is mirrored, and the opposite of her is presented in this play through Mrs. Lynde. And we get that through this little quote on 54, when Mrs. Lynde is talking to Krogstad. She says this: "A woman who has once sold herself for another's sake does not do it a second time." She is talking about, in that moment, the fact that she sold her entire youth and married a man with whom she was not in love for her mother and for her brothers as well. She forsook her youth, her childhood, in order to attain money to look out for someone else, much in the way that a parent is expected to look out for a child. In this way, she is very much the opposite of Nora in this story. But she's not the only one that has had to pay for the sins or the ailments of the previous generation. Once again, we have Rank saying, "One can't have anything in this life without paying for it," in reference, of course, to the fact that they think he inherited his disease because his father was a terrible person. So we get this theme coming back up, that children pay for those things which their parents are incapable. Nora is a mother. Nora has children. Will they pay for her? This is something that, we're forced to reckon with in this third and final act. But not yet, because there's further evidence that we pay for those things that our parents do. On page 62, Torvald is speaking to Nora. And he says this, when he has learned of her wrongdoings, her forging her father's signature years ago. "I ought to have suspected that something of the sort would happen. I ought to have foreseen it. All your father's want of principle," be silent, "all your father's want of principle has come out in you. No religion, no morality, no sense of duty. How am I punished for having winked at what he did? I did it for your sake, and this is how you repay me." So we are finally coming to terms with how Nora is paying for the sins of the prior generation, for how Nora has assumed the moral debt of her father and is acting out in that way, ironically, by forging his signature in order to accrue money. And ironically, that money's not even used for her, it's used for him. For Torvald, that is. But is there a statement as to why this is? Is there an actual statement as to how this is? Coming to us from page 63, "You will remain in my house," this is Torvald talking to Nora during the same fight. "That is a matter of course, but I shall not allow you to bring up the children. I dare not trust them to you." Stating that the belief is the moral ills of an individual are a direct impression from that individual's parents. And obviously not from Torvald. Torvald seems to have very little to do with the children, even less than he has to do with his wife, because of apparently how much he works. He is a very hands-off and distant person, especially with family. So, the question must be asked, is there any chance that a person does not suffer from the ills of their parents, is not completely defined by that which has come before them? Is there any chance for individuality to win the day? Is there any chance for a person to come to terms with their wrongs, to come to terms with their ills, to recognize their shortcomings, and break that mold, break out from that casting? Is there any chance for that? Do the players in this play believe in that? We've got to go back to that conversation on page 53 between Krogstad and Mrs. Lynde. Krogstad is in the throes of not believing Mrs. Lynde's attempts to get him to stick around and marry. He thinks he's being duped. He saw all too clearly, he believes, her character when she jettisoned from his company for a more successful man years prior. Krogstad says this, "I don't trust that. It is nothing but a woman's overstrained sense of generosity that prompts you to make such an offer of yourself when she offers to marry him." Mrs. Lynde replies, "Have you ever noticed anything of that sort in me?" To which Krogstad says, "Could you really do it? Tell me. Do you know all about my past life?" And Mrs. Lynde says, "Yes." To which Krogstad replies, "And do you know what they think of me here?" And Mrs. Lynde says, "You seemed to me to imply that with me you might have been quite another man." And Krogstad says, "I am certain of it." And Mrs. Lynde replies with, "Is it too late now?" This is really the first time in this entire play that we have people standing up against who it is that they have been and against those roles in which they have been completely entrenched, and acting against expectation, acting against perhaps even those things which might be best for them. Mrs. Lynde seems on her road to respectability, getting a new position at the bank. Krogstad, on the other hand, he really has Torvald in his grip. Torvald has to do whatever it is he says because he can blackmail him. So while and whereas Mrs. Lynde might be able to, at the beginning of the year, make money and live respectably on her own, and Krogstad, at the beginning of the year, would very easily be able to run the entire Torvald household because of this blackmail power. They decide that there might be some chance for happiness in breaking away from the roles from the roles to which they have become accustomed. Mrs. Lynde seems completely self-assured, seems to be able to get along completely well on her own. Here she is choosing not to. Krogstad finally has this bit of power that he needs to continue living the sort of slimy life that he's lived, but now he can provide for his family completely and wholly while doing so. He is able to run the place if he wants. Instead, they both choose to do something that is going to be a little harder. Krogstad is going to accept a wife with an income and still have to find some means of income for himself so that they can together support a family. Mrs. Lynde is assuming the role of a mother. Krogstad has 2 boys. She is saying here, that's fine. This is what I want to do. I want the responsibility of a household. I want that little bit of respect that comes with expectation. I think that it is something that is oftentimes overlooked in today's world. People demand respect. That's not how respect works. The cutesy way that you can easily remember what respect really means, besides the boomer phrase, respect is earned, is that when you respect, you expect. The best way that I have ever heard this relayed is a sports analogy, so bear with me if you were not a sports fan. John Elway was a quarterback, which means he was the most powerful player, essentially, on the Denver Broncos for 15 years. There was never a point in the game while John Elway was the quarterback, no matter the score, that the Denver Broncos were out of it, because he was that good. So being a Chiefs fan, they're bitter rivals. Being a Chiefs fan, you had to be on the edge of your seat the entire game. That is respect. You respected the Denver Broncos and John Elway because you had the expectation that at any moment they could score and be right back in the game. That is what Mrs. Lynde wants and is willing to assume. These are all very adult things. Assuming responsibility, assuming expectation. These are the things which Nora has had to live without. And at the end there, when she demands his ring and she will return hers, at that moment, she is saying, I want expectation. I do not want to be ornamental anymore. I demand expectation. And she's going to leave the household, which is terrifying for someone who has no skills. And Nora has no skills. Has nothing marketable, has nothing that she can go out and make money from, has nowhere really that she can stay, except for she presumes with Mrs. Lynde for the night, which is a terrifying proposition. But she is refusing to stay at this status of a child, really, to remain without expectation. Which something really, 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 really interesting happens during that debate between Torvald and Nora, when she is saying, no, I'm an adult, I will be an adult, I will leave to become an adult, which that's the only way you become an adult. You don't get, much in the same way that Nora has the same nurse around now that she did when she was a child. She's still a child. It's the same world that she lives in. She has traded her father for her husband. Her husband is another father. And we see that often throughout this play. But during this breakdown, when Torvald is so ashamed to see her go, because he has his entire world wrapped up in her, he delivers this line: "But can't we live here like brother and sister?" He's willing to give up the sexual relationship, which is the adult relationship. And he's willing to re-infantilize himself. This entire time, we've had the infantilization of Nora. She's pretty and she's cute and she's there to be observed, but she's not really good for anything. She has no utility. Here, in this moment, Torvald, who has been exclusively utility, so exclusively utility that his only friend is known by his profession, doctor, and when his friend, the doctor, comes over, they reside in Torvald's study. He is extremely on the side of utility. All he is utility. And in this line here, "But can't we live here like brother and sister?" Torvald is willing to re-infantilize himself in order to keep Nora around, which is the exact opposite of what needs to happen. He needs not to infantilize himself, but rather to imbue or to help imbue Nora with the capacity of adulthood, with the capacity of utility. But that's not what we have here. We have Torvald instead being so blind that he is willing to re-infantilize himself. And the last point I really have to make for this part of the discussion is a question more than anything else, because it does not make sense to me. Are you really claiming your adulthood and your individuality and your worth through being willing, not being willing, being more than willing, being excited to abandon your children? Torvald keeps reminding her that her main responsibility in life is her husband and her children. Husband be damned. Are you really a grown woman if you are so willing to dispose of your children? I think there's a very big question in there. I think that there is the question of perceived adulthood, perceived individuality, perceived utility. I think that many times in life, utility is simply doing that which is necessary to the circumstance in which you find yourself. And we don't get to pick every circumstance of our life. So it says a lot to me that Nora is not really assuming the role of an adult when she is so very, very willing to dispose her own children. I know she does not have much to do with them in the world as it presents itself to her. They're taken care of by a nurse and a nanny and this and that and seen by doctors, not, it seems, her. But apparently there is enough interaction that Torvald was afraid her very mothering would turn her children and his children into fiends. So, is it really claiming adulthood, claiming individuality. If one of the circumstances in which you find yourself is someone else being dependent on you, and you are more than willing to give that up, especially when that someone else is your own child or your own children. That seems to be a very pressing question to me about the end of this poem. While and whereas it seems to be a very bold proclamation of the worth in one's life of individuality and utility, is there some misconception and misperception about what that means if you're willing to abandon those obligations prior to your enlightenment? It seems to me no. It seems to me that Nora is still stuck in childhood. And she only thinks that she is ascending to the role of an adult, an individual, to having utility by abandoning her children. So that's all I have for this episode. Episode 3 of a 4-part series for Henrik Ibsen's A Doll's House. It really helps me out if you guys hit the like button. It really, really helps me out if you want to share this on some form of social media. And if you want to help me continue growing on this channel, there is, as always, a link to my Patreon to be found in the description below.